In a couple of days' time, there's going to be an announcement of a new Labour Party leader, and it's probably going to be Keir Starmer. So this is probably a good moment to have a little bit of a discussion about what left-wingers, socialists, Marxist socialists even, revolutionary socialists are doing in the Labour Party. What's our strategy? What's our overall set of aims? What's our thinking? What's our perspective about in the UK? I think 2015, I was actually expelled from the Labour Party, and that was in the course of the elections around a new Labour leader and a right-wing backlash and witch hunt in the Labour Party as a response to Corbyn. And I found, after a period of time, a very sort of strange kind of dynamic going on in terms of what other people on the left in the Labour Party were saying about people like me who had been expelled from the Labour Party. And I was expelled from the Labour Party because I'm a member of the Alliance for Workers' Liberty, and I had, in fact, been, at the time, I was editor of our newspaper. So I was sort of, kind of had a bit of a Google footprint and association with Workers' Liberty. But amongst the people in my Labour club at my university that I go to, Goldsmiths in South London, they were very kind of, at first, kind of intrigued to know why I would want to be an organised Marxist, part of an organised left group, as well as being the Labour Party. And there was a kind of, just a sort of a big kind of political gap, a political lack of understanding that we just didn't have the same kind of language to talk about socialists in the Labour Party. Those comrades, well, they're not really, they turned out to be not actually comrades, in fact, because they became people who were in favour of my expulsion. There wasn't any way to talk about it. And yet there is a fantastically rich history of left-wingers, Marxists, people who call themselves revolutionaries, being involved in the Labour Party. And all that history seems to have become quite buried and quite obscure. So I think the purpose of this session really is to go into some of that history, to talk about some examples, because there's many, many examples, and some of the dynamics around socialists and Marxists being in the Labour Party. I think there's two things for us as Workers' Liberty that stand out in terms of our assessment of what the Labour Party is. And we get this from the early debates about the Labour Party and the involvement, in fact, of people who are in the Communist Party from the 1920 onwards. That's the kind of roots of our thinking about the Labour Party. And there's two things that stand out, really, in terms of our perspective and our assessment. First of all, we see the Labour Party as being a political wing of the labour movement. It's a political wing that has always had, for us, thoroughly pro-capitalist and bourgeois politics. It's been tempered by lots of socialist politics in one way or another, but basically it's a party that's committed to the capitalist system. But it is the political wing of the labour movement, nonetheless, and it's based on bedrock organisations of the labour movement, and most specifically the trade unions. So the Labour Party and the labour movement as a whole in Britain is a kind of an amalgam. It's kind of a federation. It's kind of a bringing together of different institutions and also different traditions in a way. And it has a history of organisations being involved in it, such as the Independent Labour Party, which now no longer exists. and it has always been based on the trade union movement as it exists, and that itself has evolved. So it's a political wing of the labour movement. And a second key idea for us in terms of determining whether you would be involved in the Labour Party as well as the trade union movement, because I think most socialists would accept that you would be involved in the trade union movement. You go to work, you join your trade union, you try to make those trade unions fight for the workers in that workplace or in that industry. And you see the trade unions as being, there to exist, to bargain within capitalism, but nonetheless, they do defend workers' rights if pressed, if organised, if you try to make those organisations grow. So it would be all socialists would be involved in their trade union, but why would you also be involved in the Labour Party? And for us, the perspective has always been based on the idea that within the Labour Party, you could still organise as a socialist. You could come together as a group of like-minded socialists and organise. You could come together, in specific campaigns to win specific demands or around specific issues and organise. You could come together to fight for alternative leadership, as indeed people did around the whole Corbyn campaign, and also that there's a relative amount of freedom of debate and discussion and democracy within the Labour Party. So that's the kind of main perspective that we had. And in addition to that, we've always argued that there has been historically what we've called an open valve between the trade unions and the Labour Party. That is that the trade union class struggle issues, say for instance around the anti-union laws, could be organised for both within the trade unions and within the Labour Party, and that what you did within the trade unions could have an effect within the Labour Party. It could be taken further. It could be taken a step onwards, and by taking it into the Labour Party, that trade union struggle around trade union issue could become political and politicised, and actually could, if you took it far enough and it got enough support, could actually challenge the basis on which those trade unions are shaped or brought into, created, and that is to stymie the class struggle and to stymie the organisation of the working class, and could challenge that idea, and in so doing also challenge the nature of capitalist exploitation on some levels. So that idea of the open valve is important. So there's three things: open valve, ability to organise and ability to debate and discuss within the Labour Party, and also the idea that the Labour Party itself, in the UK at least, is founded on bedrock organisations of the labour movement. Now, within that, there's a lot of room for kind of, things going badly wrong with all of those things. There's all sorts of ways in which those things have been stymied, and all sorts of ways in which from time to time there's been a Labour leadership which has seriously put in doubt the idea that socialists could organise for change within the Labour Party, specifically, Blair, because Blair wanted to take the Labour Party back to a point in time or the Labour movement back to a point in time when it became thoroughly wedded to kind of bourgeois politics. And before the 1880s, the trade unions in particular were supporters of the Liberal Party. So he wanted to take it back to that moment in history. In you could argue that in some that's what Blair's orientation was. So there's lots of room for all that framework to kind of be pushed and pulled. There's lots of different dynamics. And I suppose it's worth just talking about some of the examples of when Marxists or socialists have organised within Labour, or have or not organised within Labour, because it hasn't always been the case that socialists have organised within Labour. How am I doing for time, Ed?
You've been speaking for 10 minutes.
Okay, well, maybe we'll just talk about a couple of examples. I think there's a history. There's lots of different histories and traditions within the socialist left in Britain. As I was saying, it's in many ways, it's a very, very rich history, which a lot of younger people, I think, in the Labour Party, in the Labour movement, don't know that much about. And that's a shame, because there would have been a time when it was sort of part of the political education of socialists to learn that history. It would be an absolutely central part of your political education to sort of know that history. Even if you weren't like a Marxist or a revolutionary, you'd really try to sort of, try to find out about that. So it's a shame. I suppose if you go right back, the first Marxist organisation in Britain was the Social Democratic Federation, which was set up in 1883. And that itself came out of a sort of tradition of radicalism in Britain, a sort of republicanism, a support for the Irish question, support for Irish independence, or on the Irish question, sort of liberation for Irish people. But it had a kind of it was very it was kind of very sort of I hesitate to use the word sectarian. I just think it had a very sort of basic attitude to the idea of spreading socialism. In fact, there's a sort of famous quote that the SDF used to spread socialism like butter on bread. It would just, if you put enough socialist propaganda out there, if you stood on enough street corners and made enough militant speeches against capitalism, then socialism would spread. And it never had this idea of kind of connecting to the struggles of working class people. As an organisation, it didn't have that idea of connecting to those struggles and trying to build those struggles and trying to develop them politically. In many ways, perhaps, it wasn't, we can forgive it a lot, because those are the sorts of things that you have to learn through experience, that it's necessary to do that, to be part of struggles, to develop them politically. And many of their people were very good militants, and they were trade unionists. But as an organisation as a whole, they were quite hostile to trade unions. And so when it came to the actual founding of the Labour Party in 1900, they wanted to argue that the Labour Party should officially see itself as a class struggle organisation. And when that went down, not very well, they mostly withdrew. I mean, some individuals didn't withdraw, but as an organisation, they did withdraw, and for a very long period of time. So it wasn't an organisation that felt it needed to get its hands dirty inside the Labour Party to try to shape it, to try to change it. And in 1900, the Labour Party was very much a kind of federation, the kind of federation that I was talking about right at the very beginning. And there was a lot up for grabs the 1900. And specifically, this is what's wrong with the SDF. It didn't see at the time the significance of the founding of the Labour Party, because what had happened is that there'd been the introduction of an anti-trade union law that was going to make effective trade unionism extremely difficult. And in that context, lots of the trade unions, more of the trade unions, were breaking from liberalism and wanted to found their own, their own political organisation, a working class organisation, a political working class organisation. And so it was a very significant, 1900 was a very specific, significant moment in history. And the SDF didn't really connect up with that. They wanted to kind of shape things in a kind of quite ultimatistic way, right? Do this or else. So that's one sort of negative example. Actually, all the examples I've got are quite negative in terms of socialist involvement. I mean, comrades can obviously talk about lots of other examples. There's examples from the early 1980s, which I suppose is the in many ways there's kind of parallels with Corbynism here, when Tony Benn stood for deputy leader of the Labour Party. And there was a lot of organising around that. And our organisation was involved in helping to set up an organising committee called the Rank and File Mobilising Committee. And so that, in a way, was kind of more of a positive example of trying to bring as many forces together to unite around a common goal, which was to get Tony Benn, in that case, elected deputy leader. But there were lots of weaknesses, lots of political weaknesses with that movement, in specifically not taking a struggle to democratise the labour movement, which was one of the key ideas that Ben had raised, into the trade union movement. And later on, there were lots of battles around rate rises and cuts inside local government, in which the left didn't play a very good role. But Ben lost that, and so a lot of the kind of lost that battle. So a lot of the potential of that movement, could have been realised if that struggle had won. There were lots of other examples. We could go into Bevanism. We could go into the example of the Communist Party itself, which did organise for a period of time inside the Labour Party. The various kinds of organised groups that see themselves as being Trotskyists have organised inside the Labour Party, and a lot haven't. Most specifically in recent years, the SWP have not. I mean, when I first came into politics, I encountered the SWP, this was in the context of the miners' strike, and at the time, inside the Labour Party, there was a lot of organising going on around the miners' strike, a lot of collecting, a lot of visiting picket lines, a lot of basic solidarity work going on inside the Labour Party. And the SWP, at the time, almost seemed to be more hostile to the idea of socialists working in the Labour Party than, I suppose, at any moment that I can remember in my political lifetime. And you'd get this kind of almost anarchist argument that if you join the Labour Party, you just drift rightwards, your head would just drift rightwards. Almost kind of, there'd be kind of almost like a physical chemical change inside your brain. You'd be affected by the consciousness, the political consciousness inside your ward Labour Party or your general committee. And you would just be affected by that environment. And there was this kind of sort of very mechanical thing about how individuals would be affected, but also how the Labour Party was always inevitably going to be, there would never be all the reforms that you could possibly win inside the Labour Party would always be, would always come to nothing almost. Now, it is true that what the Labour Party represents is a sort of trade union bargaining inside Parliament. It has that very real limitation. But they had a kind of mechanical attitude to it, that everything was doomed. Everything, every class struggle that you could possibly wage that you took into the Labour Party, including presumably the miners' strike at the time, would be stymied, would be destroyed by that effort. Okay, so we're inside the Labour Party as Marxists in order to organise, in order to develop to help develop a kind of politicisation of class struggles. But we don't stop there. We are revolutionary socialists, and we do in the course of those struggles mainly seek to educate and seek to talk about how the logic of this or that other struggle is that that we should challenge capitalism, that the capitalism is a system of exploitation ultimately, and that we need to replace capitalism in order to win this or that other reform that we may be fighting for in the here and now. So our job, we see it as essentially is to educate in the course of struggle, in not in a kind of a way which says that we've got nothing to learn from class struggle. Far from it. We have many things to learn from class struggle. Class struggle always throws up all sorts of possibilities and opportunities and ideas that out of the movement. That is our role, essentially. Okay, so I think I'm going to leave it there. I'm just trying to put in as much as possible. Maybe I had a couple of questions that maybe we could just talk about, just to kind of bring it up to date. My first question was that trade unions seem to be a very right-wing force inside the Labour Party at the moment. But more to the point, they're also extremely undemocratic. I mean, how nobody really knows how policy gets decided in Unite, for instance, or Unison, or the GMB. So if we can't democratise the trade unions, and they seem to be a very dominant force inside the Labour Party, what do we do? What are we doing inside the Labour Party? And the second question was, I wanted to know what comrades felt was good or bad about the Corbyn movement, and what socialists can learn from that. Really, if what I'm saying, in terms of perspectives, makes any sense whatsoever, what can we learn from the Corbyn movement?